There's a lot of ways that that can happen, but I think one of the distinctions that we want to make here, kind of starting off with the premise, is that the Bible is the primary reference, so it is something that you can refer back to, right? So it gives you it's a reference, and then I think a distinction that's important here is it's not necessarily something that, even if I said something, or Doug said something, or Maggie said something, anybody says something, you've also got another reference point that you would validate that against. And that goes for just anything you hear and say. And I think that's an important distinction. And that's always a big thing when anybody asks me, what's a primary difference between Christianity and others? And a lot of it comes down to the Bible. That's our reference. And I'm not trying to make things up as I go necessarily. I'm not trying to just, come up with things off the top of my head, or, as I perceive it, or as, I go to the Grand Canyon, I see something, and I come up with here's what this all means, and it's based on how I view nature. It's like I'm going back to the Bible and trying to find, that's the reference point. So good. Now with that, if you just turn the next page, I think there's another statement there that is italicized there, and it says more than 40 different writers penned the contents of the Bible over a period of more than 1,000 years. Now, with that in mind, and if you think about, if you were thinking about this, concept of, documentation, knowing the authors, is that cause you any kind of concern to know that it's so many people wrote the Bible, that it's not just one person?
I think it does the opposite for me.
Absolutely.
It proves that, for it to have consistency over 1,000 years and have examples in the Old Testament verified in the New and vice versa, it's almost like, to me, that's more proof or more reassuring to me,
Right.
of the supernatural inspiration of it.
Yeah. Now, are there any questions in terms of, that you've ever thought about in kind of thinking about, the different books of the Bible, or the time periods that the Bible was written? Has there been any kind of thing that you've ever thought of as, that it's not sometimes as neatly packaged as we would like it to be, of where it's really easy, like, we're going through a reading plan. So it's kind of an interesting timing of Doug's message and what we're doing. So we're going through a reading time. But why is it that you think people sometimes have a hard time grasping the Bible?
It's not chronological.
Right. So it's not chronological, so that makes it...
So then you don't know now why I'm reading this now, but it doesn't make sense with what was in the last chapter. It's not building on each other per se.
Right.
It is, but it's not chronological.
Right.
And then there's things like numbers.
Yeah.
Well, I think the minor prophets are hard to understand. If somebody's starting out there and they're not familiar with the Bible, probably not the best place to start.
Right.
I prefer someone to the book of John.
Right.
Why don't you restate your question again, too? It's a great question. Why do you think it's...
Do you want to restate my
Oh,
I didn't have 3 people answer. I'm going, what was the original question,
And I think but I think it's kind of, even for us that teach and maybe accept all of this, we're always being challenging ourselves to read the Bible, right? So we just said it's the primary reference, but sometimes it can be confusing for any of us.
Yes.
And so what I just wanted to do is get, why do you think it's so, what's confusing about it for you?
Well, I think the differences in culture, just to
Right.
begin with how we're living today, and the things that are important to us, or the way we define certain things, are very different than in the 1,000 years that the Bible was written. So for me personally, it's hard for me sometimes to get the context of what they're talking about until I understand or remember the cultural differences and why certain examples were used and why things were described the way they were. So I think part of it's that.
Yeah.
I
Are you asking more about the content of Old Testament?
Well, I'm
or
just
the
saying, like,
combination?
and actually, here's what, I'll give you now a, like, I'll open up my brain, and what I'm thinking is that, you know, like, when you're facilitating this, like, one of the things, and we're in a little bit of a different environment here, of where you've got everybody, but like, what I want you to do is be able to identify with a person that would be a problem, right? So, you know, because this is actually, like, just that statement there, that it was written over this long period of time, and many authors, there's a lot of people that causes an issue for, right? You know, and so, you know, but if we're honest, we all have to be challenged ourselves in reading the Bible, and a lot of times we don't understand it, but we've accepted the fact, and that we have a personal relationship with God, so He's kind of opened things up. But, you know, this would be you know, a difficult thing if I was, yeah.
Yes, I would say, though, if you're looking at a history book, one person could not have written the history of the world.
Right.
Because they'd be dead.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it has to be passed on.
Yeah.
But it's also written in different voices, you know, it's
Right.
David himself, and then somebody else is writing about somebody. So I could see where someone would say, well, if I open a book, it's always in either first or third person, but this
Right.
is all over the map, maybe confusing to some people.
Right.
I think one of the main reasons, and I don't know if we always really know, it's life-changing and it's the living Word of God. So when you read it, you're not just like a novel, you're not just reading a novel. It's going to somehow speak into your heart and your soul and your spirit and directing for change.
Right.
And that's uncomfortable. And sometimes people don't want change, and that's why I think.
You know, and I sometimes say, as we're facilitating, I'll sometimes say to the person, because you will have people in here that challenge this stuff.
Yeah.
They challenge the Bible, they challenge Christianity, and they were raised a Buddhist, or they were raised something. And they will bring this to the table, which you welcome as a facilitator. Great, this is awesome, this is wonderful, no matter what happens, no matter what. It's always terrific for you to be facilitating in a group where that happens. And this was last week when I said, well, here's what I would do. Valerie said, here's what I would do. And Kevin went, well, here's the right answer. But this is one of those places where I asked the person, would you be willing to just not shelf that question, but observe that question and be with that question for the next 5 or 6 weeks as we delve a little deeper, as we listen to more of what Andy Stanley has to say. So this is a time where I'm definitely open to hearing what they have to say, but letting them know we're not going to answer that concern here. We're not here to solve that problem or answer that concern today.
So you would not say, someone says, what if somebody asks you a question? Like, how did they choose the 40 writers? And what about the story, you know, like all these, like, you know, like, is there references are we supposed to say, I don't know? Or
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Okay, if you don't have the answer to that question, you go, you know, I've never thought that question myself. I've never asked them. I don't have a clue.
Okay.
I'll come back to you next week after I talk to somebody much more, you know, much more informed than me, and you just call Russ.
I know there's always like teams and scholars that got together and, you know, but I don't know the exact name.
Well, and I think that, like, in the guide itself, you know, I think some of the things that I'll do is I'll try to point out some of the statements first, you know, before we get into, like, the real technicalities of it. Because it's kind of like, you know, like, it does get into the fact, like, right after the passage that we had just read is more than the 40 different authors. It does talk about its different backgrounds, its different styles of writings. It gives a little bit of why it can be, you know, on one hand, it can be a little bit hard to, you know, it can be hard to access for an average reader if they don't understand some of the background behind some of the books, and that there's different styles, right? So you go from a poetic book that may talk about things very dramatically and poetically, and then you go to a very teaching thing. It doesn't mean that you use the poetic thing to necessarily teach literally, But then there are parts of the Bible that are literal, and it's like they were told to do something, and that's, it's very literal. So you've got a lot of that going on in there, and you've kind of got to understand that. So just like reading a Shakespeare or something like that, you've got to understand a little bit of like some of the backgrounds and things like that.
And at the same time, I love when people bring me questions I can't answer, and I welcome that. So I think if you have that stance, and you're not nervous, because if you're nervous, they're going to see, oh no, not that question. That's the one I don't know, So you want to, I don't have a clue, but let's find out. If you make a big deal of it, then it makes everybody uncomfortable,
And Maggie, might there be somebody in your group that might have the answer?
There might, and that can be as much of a time-ticking bomb or
really? Okay.
or good news. I mean, it depends.
Okay. Yep.
But frequently we'll kick open stuff for the group like that.
And I've got I brought a couple of things that I'll bring out when we get to one of the other sections, but just to highlight is that and it's referenced in your book, there's startingpoint.com, and there's actual, just a list of articles. And I printed out 2 that are applicable to this. This part in particular kind of can lend itself to maybe having a few of those. And I'll bring I've got the ones that I had printed off, but it does get into where did the Bible come from, how some of that, and you can either direct people to that, and then some of the interesting things you could potentially even do is have somebody pull it one week if it comes up, and then bring it the next week, and say, here, what did you find out about that? That's always interesting to do. Is like if you don't necessarily, because I'm not the Bible answer man, but
don't call Russ.
but I can Google it.
Yeah, exactly. It's a great homework assignment. Great question. That's your homework assignment. Bring it in next week.
But there are some things right on that starting point that I think are really helpful, and there's some ones that you may even want to print out and bring to the class, because it is a way just to have something in front of people. You don't necessarily have to read it off, but just a person can have a reference.
What was the comment on the CD by Andy about just the 4 Gospels? That's all we're going to do. I mean, is that true? Is that the basis of?
Yeah, and I think what's so.
Or was he just referencing it to the point he was bringing home?
I think
about the validity of the 4 Gospels and the repeatability.
Yeah, and I think that there's a couple things. Now, the material isn't going to focus on, we're not going to focus on just the 4 Gospels. But I think from, what he's doing is to really kind of prove it, because if we just focus on the 4 Gospels, which is kind of central to our faith, is what's the documentation around that? And let's just focus on that now. Because the problem is if you do get into the Old Testament, it is difficult because there's a history lesson that goes along with it. You've got to understand all, thousands of years of history, because it's very difficult to just pull, something out of Numbers and then kind of surmise this is what God meant, and this is what, but in the Gospels we kind of have everything, it's the culmination of all of that. So if we just focus on that, so I think it's a way that he's kind of doing it to, let's just focus on this. I would do the same thing. If somebody brings up stuff out of the Old Testament, it's I have no idea what's some of that. And it's but it's kind of focusing people back on, let's just kind of concentrate on the 4 Gospels. But we will, and I think what I've heard from a lot of people that have gone through this is they've said, it's helped me kind of understand the connection to the Old Testament, New Testament. So people will have that once they've gone through this material, I think.
There you go. And I'm